What is panpsychism?
Ah, Panpsychism. Pan means all, psychism, psyche, all is psyche, is coined by Patrizzi in the 16th century, a Renaissance thinker. And it means that all of nature, all of the entities of nature have mind or consciousness of some sort. Maybe it's not fully conscious as we know it, but subconscious or experiential at least. So that means that, organisms such as ourselves, humans, have mind, but also insects, plants, fungi, molecules, atoms, all the way down. It's all the way down consciousness, but it's not consciousness of everything. So, although it should be by definition. So, there's an important distinction to be made between aggregates and monads. So, for example, this pen, it hasn't got a consciousness per se, because it's not an entity, or it's not a self-sufficient unit, as it were. Whereas a plant has, In most forms of panpsychism today, there are various forms, and they will differ slightly.
Yes.
But I just add, though, that panpsychism, coined by Patrizzi, is more of what we today would understand as pantheism. So that means mind all the way up instead of all the way down. But that connotation has changed through the years.
How should I think about my own subjectivity, my own subjective agency, my own consciousness under a panpsychism or a pantheistic lens?
I suppose you would think of human consciousness as just a very evolved form of the consciousness that exists throughout nature. So a complex form that brings in many different sense modalities and introspection and so on. But as only a difference in degree compared with other forms of life, as opposed to a difference in kind. So the general idea of today, arguably, is emergentism. You know that the brain makes emerge the mind, or the brain generates the mind. And there's a question as to where that started. Most people don't believe it's only humans. Descartes did, of course, but although he was a dualist. But where do we start? Do we start at the lobster level, as we say in philosophy of mind? Anything less complex than that doesn't have mind. But at the least, generally, the general worldview today in the West is probably that there was a point in the history of the universe where suddenly there emerged consciousness or some form of basic experience, right? Whatever that organism might have been. And this is actually, if you believe this, it's a radical jump in the history of the universe, right? Because first of all, the universe was completely insentient, completely unconscious, and then bang! No matter how simple it was, it wouldn't have gradually come in. There must have been like a switch where suddenly there's a perspective on reality from reality, right? Emerging out of reality. That's emergentism. Panpsychism is the view that this never happened, that there's just been a gradual evolution of consciousness through the history of the cosmos. And so you don't have this jump up. And so the way of thinking of human consciousness is just, sort of the current point of that development. But it's not something particularly special. So it's kind of more of a, I don't know, in one way, more of a naturalistic perspective.
Yes. But the elements that make me are instantiated in my biology in some way. The elements that make you, Peter, are in your biological system in some way. But consciousness itself, and correct me if any of this is wrong, is not in our biological system. It is something more fundamental at the bedrock of reality. And then it's something like the interaction between those two gives me my subjectivity. This is why I struggle with this. So let's help me try understand this.
Yeah. Okay. Well, generally, panpsychists, again, today, the common form, which you get, like exemplified in Galen Strawson, who's a sort of British analytic philosopher, is an identity form of identity theory. So it's not that consciousness somehow separate from biology. It's sort of, part and parcel of biology. The only issue is that when we say biology or physiology, essentially matter, some kind of living matter, what we understand by matter is inadequate, insufficient sort of concept. So we don't really fully understand what matter is. I mean, in physics, of course, this is constantly developing, and if you look at the history of the concept of matter, it's changed through the years. With Descartes, you had just pure extension. As the years went by, you added mass, charge, spin, etc., etc. But we don't believe that we've achieved, the absolute understanding of matter at the moment. So when we talk about even biology as a material substrate, we still don't fundamentally understand what that is. And there are different theories about it amongst physicists even, some of which are contradictory. But so the panpsychist view is that what we understand if we understood matter more sufficiently, it would contain elements of mind within it. So it's not that mind is separate from biology, let's say, but it's biology is rather richer than we generally understand it to be.
And when you use the word mind, can you kind of expand outwards on exactly what you mean by that word? You have a mental model in your head of mind whenever you use that word. Like what's the best way to think about mind in this case?
Well, as you probably know, like it's a very ambiguous term, right? And Swedish doesn't even have a word for mind, really. It has sort of
Really?
yeah, it has sin and vetenskap, knowledge, and so on, but it doesn't really have this word mind. Word mind in English is also like quite ambiguous. Has etymologies going back to memory and intellect. What do I understand by it? Well, it's the old question: what is consciousness, essentially, right? So, the way I look at it, I always have looked at it well, not always. I've developed a way of looking at it in a tripartite manner, right? In three ways. So, one could talk about the contents of consciousness. So that would be things like, sensations, colors, sound, sense, etc. Cognition in terms of reason, inference, conceptualization, and then modes of those contents like the speed, the time rate of consciousness, whether it's veridical or delusionary, and so on and so forth. So that's like, basically the remit of phenomenology, like really introspecting and understanding, what we as humans, how we experience the world. That's one way. The second way is to say, well, to understand mind, it's really useful to sort of argue what it's not, right? So how is mind distinctive from non-mind, generally meaning matter, the concept matter? So then we can talk about things like privacy. I mean, all of these are debatable now, and this is why there's no solid answer to the question, right? Because
yes,
when you give an answer, they're all debatable. But I'll tell you, just list a few basic debates. So privacy, a lot of people argue that the mind is private, so I can feel my toothache, you can't. You can infer it if my mouth is bleeding and I'm saying I've got a terrible toothache, but you can't feel it, right? And this kind of makes study of the mind, problematic in a way because it becomes privacy or first-person access means non-empirical or unobservational, right? And this is why probably we have the hard problem of consciousness and mind-matter problem as well. Privacy is one of this second branch. Another one, which is more common in philosophy of mind today, is intentionality, although it comes from Brentano and actually before that. So that's the notion that mental states always are about something, they kind of reach out. So in love, something is loved, in hate, something is hated, and thought, something is thought about, and so on, right? This is something that mental states have, but my pen doesn't seem to have. It doesn't reach out. Hasn't got the relationality. And there are other contenders as well. Descartes famously said that mind is non-spatial and matter is spatial. William James debated this because imaginations can be spatial. If you imagine triangles, it has spatial properties, right? Non-inferentiality from Bertrand Russell, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, that's the second strand. How does, all these debates about how mental states or mind might differ from non-mind. And then thirdly, we could talk about the relations of mind. So not the differences so much, but relations. So we can talk about how the concepts mind and matter relate. This is the fundamental mind-matter problem, right? So we can talk about, traditionally you've got dualism from Plato and Descartes, that mind and matter are completely separate substances. Perhaps they interact, perhaps they don't interact with Leibniz, but they interact with Descartes, for example, and that's the belief in the soul. So when you die, the soul survives. Another option is the physicalism. There's many types. So like the mind is the brain, or at least parts of the activity of the brain, simply identical, like the morning star and the evening star, identical, Venus. Or emergentism, that the brain and nervous system generates the mind, common today, like I said, also common over 100 years ago with British emergentism, or, etc., different types of physicalism. Another option is idealism, which is, big in Germany 200 years ago, and in Britain, actually, at the beginning of the 20th century. The British idealists, but that's the view that mind is the fundamental substance, not matter, and matter is really a projection. We project the world we see for evolutionary reasons, we'd say today. So, colors and scents and sounds don't really exist out there. They're just our way of perceiving the world. But if you take that more radically with Kant, for example, even space and time are projections and don't really exist mind independently. And then there's a kind of absolute monism, so epitomized by Spinoza, and that's that mind and matter are both different expressions of a fundamental substance, which he calls God or nature. And then there's also, one should take into account the possibility of transcendent forms like truths of mathematics and so on, which seem to have some kind of existence which is more solid than, let's say, fictional characters like Sherlock Holmes. So like the Pythagorean theorem seems to have a kind of subsistence or a kind of truth which is not dependent on anyone ever thinking about it, right? So it would have been true before humans existed. So anyway, and some philosophers argue that you need to take that into account when you're thinking about mind. So yeah, that's basically, if you ask what is mind, then there's just three main ways to go, like the phenomenology, the contents, the differentiations like privacy and so on, and the relations like idealism, physicalism, dualism, whatever, right? And all of those, especially the third way to go, involves centuries or if not millennia of thought. And the interesting thing about the 21st century, I find, is that these questions have opened up again, and there seems to be no real agreement. Whereas towards the end of the 20th century, there's a kind of agreement coming on, and a kind of common sense. Well, what was believed to be a common sense view, but that kind of fell apart. And so that's why I think panpsychism has become popular again to a certain extent, because we're starting from the beginning again. And so we're looking at the past and thinking, have we completely misunderstood this question? Like
Yes.
what the ancient thinkers tell us, or what might they tell us?
It was a great historical overview. You can tell that you lecture on this stuff, right? You just have all the names and all of the different. I hope the listeners were able to follow along there. I try to keep these. I'll put all of the definitions at the bottom so people can follow along as much as possible. But I feel like it's just going to be rapid firing through them. But I hope they can follow along. So you gave a great historical overview there, but I'm curious. Like, do you have a sentence or two sentences in your head that you believe, based on all of that history and overview, that you think that is what mind is? Like you gave a great kind of textbook definition there, but like, what do you think yourself?
What do I think myself? Well, I generally say today, I don't believe anything. I entertain ideas, right? Because the reason for that is I've got my preferences, which I'll go into in a second. But generally speaking, I don't think anyone can be certain about any of these things, right? And one of the reasons can't be certain is because of this problem of privacy that I mentioned. If elements of mind are not, if they cannot be observed, then how can we know? And then you get into epistemology, right? What is knowledge, right? How can we know things? Things are mathematics without observation. But with philosophy of mind, or metaphysics of mind, I think we go for inference to best explanation. What is the most plausible? What's the most parsimonious logically? What kind of resolves certain issues down the line, and so on. And also, I think a historical viewpoint is useful, because you realize that what we take for granted today, you can sort of trace why people take these things for granted. And when you look at the origins, sometimes like a lot of the current form becomes questionable. Interestingly, I think a lot of our current views of the mind stem from the Reformation 500 years ago, right, in Christianity. Anyway, what preference do I have? I did my PhD on panpsychism, but I'm really, I suppose I prefer Spinoza's, or a caveated form of Spinoza's theory. And Spinoza is a monist, like, there's one substance. There's not, as opposed to Descartes' two, mind, body. He's a monist, there's one substance. But that substance is deeper, richer than both mind and matter. So mind and matter are both expressions or attributes of that one deeper substance, which he argues humans are not privy to. We cannot actually know this. It's beyond our human possibilities. And I'm kind of, why am I sympathetic to monism? Well, it's very parsimonious, very logical. It has fewer assumptions, and it does away with a lot of problems in mind studies. So, for example, the problem of how mind emerges from non-mind is not there because they're the same thing.
Yeah.
And the downward causation, mental causation, it's not really a problem so much because, again, is not like a downward causation from one level to the next. They are one level. So you get psychophysical to psychophysical causation, one line of causation. So it resolves these kind of deep questions. And what I don't like about Spinozism, though, is that he's basically a fatalist or a determinist. So there's no free will there. Although there is mental causation or physical mental causation, there's no freedom. And I'm sort of more in line with Alfred North Whitehead, this British philosopher's thought here, where he allows for creativity for various reasons we can get into if you want. But yeah, so I suppose my natural tendency goes towards a kind of mixture of Spinoza and Whitehead's thought.
The Giant's Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel. Check out our 26 Neuroscience book. You can download it for free